we essentially have induced this massive passivity. And can you imagine what that does to your dignity and to your personal pride as a human being?
Mm.
To sit at home, you almost pay people not to work.
Mm.
Because it's almost as if, you get the grant because you're unemployed. You get the grant because you are not productive. What sort of a nation do you build that way?
Hello, my name is Donald. I'm currently filling in for Petrus, who's currently being charged for high treason. This is WorldView, where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with advocate Frans Rautenbach. The advocate has been part of a legal team of the Free Market Foundation in a constitutional challenge of Section 32 of the Labour Relations Act. His interest in the impact of labour law and industrial unrest has resulted in the completion of numerous books like South Africa Can Work and Set the Workers Free. Frans, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So Frans, I read in your book, South Africa Can Work, that you mentioned that your children, or some of your children, were supporters of the EFF. Can you explain to us, why do you think that's the case? Why are young children, especially some white children, drawn to the EFF?
I think the capitalist and free market system in the West has become the victim of its own success. Our young people don't know what happened in order to get where we are, and that this is not the default state of the world. The world is not a prosperous free market where everybody gets cell phones and cars and food to eat and all the wonderful things that the market give us. So they notice things that are wrong in the world, which is good. They should protest against them, but it appears that there is this myth that it is the capitalist world which is responsible for taking good from the poor and giving it to the wealthy, whereas in fact it's the other way around. So I think it's that misconception. It's not knowing where it started.
So it's actually the socialist policies that are leading to this, and they incorrectly blame it on capitalism.
I think what happened was that every so often, and it happens in every generation, there is a group of people who say, this time we're going to make socialism work. We're going to make a success of it. And all the other attempts before that, even those where 10 million people and 100 million people in one country or another country died, were not real socialism. So what we are going to do now, at last, is real socialism. And the AOC crowd, the Green Revolution crowd in the United States, for example, Bernie Sanders' people, they all believe that they can sell this idea that now, at long last, we're going to have this socialist paradise.
Do you think
and
also,
of course, every time it fails.
Do you think also it might be the case that in guilt, guilt is attractive because then you don't have to do anything? Because I mean, if you're guilty of everything, you have to sit back and not take responsibility for anything. So I think that's also perhaps a reason for why young people are so attracted to this, because they have to sit back then.
I suspect so, especially if you're part of the privileged group. Then you're almost trapped in this moral dilemma of knowing what is wrong, but your privilege is what is wrong, so you're supposed not to do anything at all. It's the most defeatist exercise in the world, as opposed to saying let's just face that there are certain things that might need to be dealt with. But if we're all paralyzed by the fear of guilt, nothing is going to happen. So I believe there is that element, and I've heard people say that because I'm white and privileged, I should simply keep quiet,
Mm,
should say nothing, nothing should happen. Uh, how the world will carry on, then I don't know either. Not that white people are the only people, but it so happens that at this stage there are talented people amongst the privileged white who can play a leading role.
mm. So, on that note, you mentioned in your book about white privilege that when white people or Europeans landed on these shores, they were already privileged. Can you explain to us what do you mean by that and why is it relevant?
Yeah, it's relevant because we live in an era where there's this notion of affirmative action and black economic empowerment that is meant to, if I can call it this way, unscramble the egg. In other words, we have this unbelievable history of mixed fortunes, and somehow affirmative action is meant to place us all in the position that we would have been in but for the discrimination and the colonialism of the
Mm,
past. So it is this unbelievably uh, arrogant notion that we can look into some backward looking crystal ball and say, we know what the world would have looked like, hypothetically, if everybody was fair and decent from the start.
mm,
And the problem is we don't. It is absolutely impossible. And one example of that is then to say, when the colonialists arrived in the Cape, they were already miles ahead in the race, if you may call it that, the
mm,
race of privilege, technology, medical advances, property, scientific development, education, and economic skill. So, in those respects, the people who arrived in the Cape were already way ahead in the race. Now, let's suppose at that point in time, they had said, well, we are going to make everybody live in a liberal society, which would have meant that the local people would have gone to the same schools, they would have had the same opportunities, and so on. Now,
mm,
the question that you have is, what about all that privilege that went before, which was nothing to do with discrimination? People just happened to be lucky. It's a sheer stroke of luck that they grew up in Europe, where there was agriculture, where the rivers were navigable, and so on and so on. With the result that those people who arrived in the Cape were not going to sit around and wait for the rest to catch up. Is exactly the same thing that's still happening today. When you look at 1994, what happened to the white privileged economic grouping? They carried on working. In fact, there you sit, an entrepreneur trying to make something of your world, and I would believe quite successfully so. And there are hundreds and thousands of people in that book. In fact, the best thing that ever happened to white people in this country was being let loose from the tethers and the apron strings of apartheid, because now they were on their own and they had to make do. Now, going back to 1952, people would have carried on. How do you account for that? If you want to unscramble that egg, how do you go back and say, well, uh, I must account for the fact that people are ahead? Thomas Sowell, who's one of the great economists
mm,
of the 20th and 21st century, has made numerous analyses of how people uh, derive their privilege and their relative position, and how different people are. And he makes this interesting point. He says even twins in the same house don't have equal outcomes.
mm,
How on earth do we expect different groupings like races with absolutely different backgrounds to have the same outcomes?
mm,
So equal outcomes and even equal opportunities are pipe dreams. They cannot work. So the simple point is you cannot unscramble the egg. And that's very important. It's not a minor matter, because if you can't unscramble the egg, it may well be that the best way is to follow the principle of Pythagoras in saying, first do no harm, just let it be,
Mm.
because it will develop as it should. You can't unscramble the egg, and you can't make people be in the position that they would have been in that nirvana, that utopia of a supposed fair society. It's impossible.
Mm. So if you also apply that in the current land debate, you can also say, let's say we give the black land first and EFF everything. And in the hypothetical, we say white people stole all the land. Even if you admit that, it still doesn't account for example, the cultivation techniques, the technology, everything that came with the Europeans. You have to account for that as well. Like you said, the white privilege that came with the Europeans.
Yes, you have to, and also there's so little really that depends. It's this notion that land is the be all and end all of wealth differences is an absolute myth. There's
Mm.
simply no truth in that. The real capital, if you like, is human capital, and that's what is between your ears. Unfortunately, that takes development, and everybody should get the best possible opportunity that they can get to develop that capital between their ears. But uh, land, the development of land is just one minor resource in the bigger scheme of things.
Mm.
It's not land that makes people rich, not land per se.
Mm.
It may be one way, but and I think that if you try, as you say, try and unscramble that egg, how do you account for the centuries of technology that goes into agriculture and so
Mm.
on? So it's a very frustrating exercise.
So, Frans, I know you're quite a labor law expert. Can you tell us a bit for our viewers how labor laws are holding back us in South Africa? How bad the situation really is in that regard?
Um, I don't think there's a single labor law that does not have the effect of increasing the cost of labor. Um, the reason is that each and every one of those laws operate in the same way as a minimum wage. Now, if you have a minimum wage that says that someone is only allowed to work for 3,500 Rand a month, which is more or less what the national minimum wage now is. What you're in effect saying is that if somebody's productivity is such that it can produce less than 3,500 Rand per month, you are outlawing that person
Mm.
working. And that is grossly unfair. Um, Millions of South Africans will now have experienced the lockdown. And what you say with a lockdown very often, take the restaurant industry, is you're not allowed to work. You are locked down. We stay at home. We are not allowed to work. Now, what you say with a minimum wage of 3,500 Rand to those millions, and believe me, they are millions
Mm.
of people who cannot work for more than 3,500 Rand. They cannot justify that wage. What you're saying, in effect, is you are locked down. You're not allowed to work. Uh, I don't think we should have any illusions about the immorality of that set of laws. And believe me, there is no exception. They're all the same. The trade union laws, combined strike laws, which say that people may strike with impunity. I always think if you conclude an employment contract and you say, I undertake to work for you and you undertake to pay me for my work, what you do is make a solemn promise that you will work.
Mm.
Now, what the law says is it's okay for you to break your promise. You solemnly promised that you would work for me, but you know what? You can strike with impunity. You will not lose your job. That, to my way of thinking, is immoral, not only because it is unfair that you can break a promise in that way with impunity, but it's also unfair because it likewise pushes up the cost of labor. It makes it more expensive because it's the old issue of something for nothing.
Mm.
which, in a way, if you strip away the detail, is what is wrong with the system in South Africa to a very large extent. It is
So
all a system of something for nothing.
the problem is also probably it hampers mobility. It's difficult to fire someone, so there's the wrong people in certain kind of jobs, and yeah, there's no mobility.
Yeah, you find that you are stuck.
Mm.
The first difficulty with being obliged to jump through countless hoops in order to dismiss somebody is that you are disinclined to hire them in the first place,
Mm.
because it is so much trouble, it is so expensive, and it is so risky. So why would you then go through the difficult exercise of bothering to employ somebody? You'd much rather then use alternatives. And the alternatives, as we know by now, are moving to Lesotho or Botswana or Swaziland, or buying a machine, or not employing somebody at all, or not starting in business, or going overseas with your business.
Mm.
So
Or
all
just
of these possibilities.
paying in cash, which deprives the person of a contract to protect them in
Yeah,
informal sectors.
that's the other thing. You must look at the whole package. If you want to look at workers' benefits, it is the whole package that matters. And the moment you force employers to start ducking and diving, you cause alternatives, uh, evading and avoiding
Mm.
of, uh, of benefits, and workers end up being worse off. The other thing, of course, is that we now have a huge illegal immigrant worker population, because they don't run to the CCMA. They
Mm.
know it's far better to keep quiet and work, and they generally very often work harder than the locals. So all kinds of difficulties arise, but in the end, it's the poorest people who suffer the most.
Mm. Can you give us some example of how unions are holding us back, like SATU and the other unions?
Yes, there are various ways, but the fundamental thing is that the labor laws protect trade unions artificially. First of all, by way of giving them all sorts of legs up in terms of how they can increase their membership, how they can get into the workforce, how they can hold meetings, how they can organize, and so on. And then, of course, you're not allowed. That is well known. You can't terminate somebody's employment for being a union member, and so on. So there's a whole variety of benefits, which all combined have the effect that the unions have power. They also have the power to represent workers in disciplinary hearings. So they make ample use of that opportunity as a tactical means to embarrass employers. And they also have the ability to organize strikes. That's probably one of their most significant um, powers, is the ability to organize strikes. And approximately 99% of all strikes are organized by unions. So the result is that you have that pushing up of the labor cost, which in turn results ultimately in greater unemployment. You mentioned SATU. SATU is the South African Democratic Teachers Union, which has almost single-handedly uh, hijacked education in South
Mm.
Africa, with the exception of some Model C schools and some private schools, of course. Those have largely managed to escape the clutches. But it's so bad that in some jurisdictions, and this is government recorded results, in some areas, the trade unions have managed to take over schools and sell principals' posts. Headmasters' posts are sold to the
Wow.
highest bidder. Members of the union stand in line to buy. So I think the government is trying to put a lid on that kind of thing. But in the meantime, you have the labor laws operating and the unions exploiting the labor laws in the education system to full extent, which in turn has the effect that you have as the old Russian saying goes, duly adapted, is where the teachers pretend to teach and the learners pretend to learn, and then they pretend to qualify them at the end of the day. It's appalling. I mean, nobody has any idea of the true extent of the malaise that is South African education. It is an absolute mess, and one doesn't foresee that it will, without intervention from the private sector. I don't even think we must put our hope on government. Government's not going to fix it.
So there's almost no real hope of doing it through legislation. Do you think like online schooling and, like you said, the private sector is going to solve that problem for us?
I think that's the start. I have now the next book that I'm writing has to do with the question. It's all very well now to identify what's wrong with the system and how the system should change, but the problem is, what is the mechanism by which we force the reform?
Mm.
It's a different issue. And what I've started doing is, for example, take the one that you're raising, which is schools. If we want to reform schools, we want to show by way of examples. You might have seen, reading the first chapter of the book, that I pay quite a bit of heed to the principle of reform that occurred in China, where the free economic zones were
Mm-mm.
set up
Yeah.
by the leadership and showed by way of example, demonstration, what enormous benefits a free market, even if it's a free market contained to a little municipal area, what that could achieve.
That's such
And
a
because of that,
fascinating. Sorry, that's such a fascinating concept to me. That, say you're a socialist country, okay, but we're gonna
yes,
have these pockets of capitalism. It's like a solid.
yes,
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's,
it's
you know, it's
it's
just an amazing
absolutely
idea.
wonderful. And the World Bank analyzed this process, and Shanghai, for example, which is one of the very first ones, has become such a superpower in its own right.
Hmm.
And everybody in China now wants to be part of that. That is the example that they want to follow. So it is no longer a case of having to argue with the government and persuade them by way of rational argument. You just look on the ground, look at the experience, and presto, there's a ready made example which everybody wants to follow. And that's how they manage to reform. And I believe the only way we can do it here is the same way. But now, imagine this government now setting up free market zones which are bound to expose the weaknesses of its own system.
Hmm.
So I don't hold out much hope that they will do that. I think the private sector should take the initiative and do it themselves. We should show the people that what we call school choice, where there's a freedom of choice between government schools and a variety of models of private schools, that is the way to go, and ultimately the best private schools will emerge. There's a wonderful movement going on. I mean, we all the latest example is the riots in KwaZulu Natal, where the civil society simply jumped in and
Hmm.
started rebuilding society,
Yeah,
and
provided the army with ammo.
yes, providing the army with ammo. Of course, private security companies have long been an essential bulwark against crime in this country. And so you can go on. I mean, I believe money systems, for example, the whole Bitcoin
Hmm.
revolution or um, cryptocurrency revolution is all the result of people rebelling against government interference. And I believe it's a peaceful revolution, but a very powerful one, which is happening.
No, I totally agree with you that that would probably not work in South Africa, the free market zones, because we have such a weak government. But in China, it does work because, in contrast, the government is so strong. The state is so authoritarian. You can do it
Yeah,
there.
no, it's an amazing thing. One has this enormous dilemma that democracy is not always the best friend of freedom. There appears to be an inherent contradiction there, by which I'm not saying for a moment that that is what I want. Uh, Please don't misunderstand me. I don't think we should have a totalitarian society that enforces a free market. The examples of that have also been mixed, to say the least. I think the way to do it is to keep your essential liberal uh, infrastructure in place, but to allow people to build up the free market from the bottom up rather than the other way around. And you don't do that by government allowing them. People must seize that freedom themselves. They must practice freedom by seizing it. You don't you can't go and ask for it. It won't happen because there are too many um, conflicting interests that the government is trying to please.
So, if we can take it back to South Africa, now we know that the unions have such influence for all, for example, SATU. Do you think the government really can't do anything, or are they just hiding behind the unions? Are they just using it as an excuse? But can they really do something about this? Do they really, or do the unions have so much control that they have paralyzed the government?
It's a political game. Bear in mind always that we are in a democracy. So somebody like Cyril Ramaphosa, who incidentally has a huge support base in the unions, that's where he comes from,
Mm,
um, cannot really afford to be seen to ditch that support base. So he has to be seen to be loyal, to serve their interests in a manner which is sufficient to retain that vote. And in years past, the unions used to help the ANC to get the vote out. They had to go into the townships and bring people to the voting stations. They assisted, and that partnership is under strain. But that doesn't mean the government's going to ditch them. I can't see that happening in a short while.
So even if they implement the right policies, you don't see the unions ditching them, or a degree of the right policies.
I don't think so. I think what I'm hoping to see is a gradual shifting of the reality on the ground. The only way by which the government will start moving is because its voter base is starting to move.
Mm,
And there are at the moment the debate is about whether there should be a basic income grant. Now that is no small change, literally and politically speaking.
mm,
What that means is you buy the vote, however miserable an existence that is,
mm,
to buy with that kind of handout a vote. You're talking about 10 million people. In fact, the number of people receiving grants in this country now are 18 million.
wow.
Just get your mind around that. 18 million, which is more than the number of employed people, more than the number of taxpayers by a country mile, and more than the number I think, of voters in this country. So what you have is a massive, massive, massive block of people who can be bought and are bought with what I can only call a miserable existence. I mean, how much can you actually eat?
Mm,
How do you make that living? But what you do is it's this absolute recipe for passivity. Because the more you move, for example, if you want to take transport to go and look for a job, it costs money.
mm,
So what you have is you've got a free house, a government provided house. You have free electricity. You have your food, which comes from the grant, and that means that you sit because you can't move. It's not economical to move.
mm.
So people sit at home and do nothing. It's a terrible existence, and there's this notion that the government will provide. Um, which has the effect that there's absolutely no incentive to work. So that is the reality that must change. And to come back to your question, to change that, you have to show pockets of prosperity. The only way to do that is there are ways to escape. Private agreement can actually escape very large proportion of labor laws, the effect of labor laws.
Mm.
And by doing that, you will create many free market zones for labor. You can show to the populace out there, you can make uh, 3,000, 4,000 Rand a month by working, as opposed to sitting at home and getting 600 or 1,000 Rand uh, for doing nothing.
Mm.
And suddenly that ethos, that pride, that dignity of working for your own bread will start taking over. That's the only way. I don't see this government bringing laws to change
Yeah, I think
us.
also the problem is they have sort of a catch-22 situation. If they provide prosperity, those voters tend to go to the DA and the other parties because they think, okay, but I want more. And if they don't, people get frustrated. So they sort of catch in the middle that they don't really have a way out of this. It's like they're doomed to
Yes,
fall, the ANC.
I think so. One of the ways to do it is possibly to have a bit of a cooperation between the parties and start, take in the Western Cape. I can imagine that one can see little pockets of experimentation happening uh, there, and the central government, would simply allow this to proceed. That's one way. You see it already. Take for electricity. Western Cape was way ahead of the others in seeing the obvious point that private people can generate
Mm.
electricity. Why not? Helen Zille was way ahead of the rest by starting to have experimental schools where you start a little pilot, which is government funded. It may well be, but what it does is it affords a private entrepreneur the opportunity to run the school. That's the principle of school choice. And there are numerous other examples where you can see that. Also, I was privileged to join a group of farmers in Witzenberg, Ceres area, who PALS, PALS, which is a nice acronym uh, for I forget what it stands for, but
Vrienden.
Vrienden. It's a powerful white and black powerful empowerment cooperation, and it's wonderful. As you say, the intellectual property sits there. They've been developing it for centuries, and what they now do is they simply duplicate that blueprint onto a neighboring farm, but with black ownership, and but extremely rigorous selection, first of all, through psychological and psychometric testing, and then very rigorous training and monitoring, which goes on for something like 10 years before a farmer. And then you have success stories,
Wow.
massive success stories. But for that, you need government to stay out of the way. Rather, it's far better that way.
So I know we agree that, okay, there's no real point. We're not going to see labor law changes anytime soon. But aren't many of these labor laws enshrined in the Constitution? So that's the problem in its own situation as well. I mean, you're most likely going to need like two-third majorities.
I saw that question coming, and I think it's an excellent question. It's something which has bothered me for a while.
Yeah. I studied
I
law
think
myself,
they,
and I saw these laws in the Constitution.
yeah,
It's
I,
pointless.
I believe there's a way out of it. What I've now done is I've written an argument in the new book on the basis of which one can attack Section 5 of the Labour Relations Act, which incidentally is duplicated by another Section 5 in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Those are your two, I suppose, your major labour laws. What Section 5 says in effect is that it's illegal to contract out of labor law. An employer and employee may not agree that labor laws don't apply to their relationship. Now, that is extremely important because if we can get rid of that, we can just attack that as unconstitutional and struck that from the statute book, you will have a major change. Now, how does that work? You can say that there is a common law right of freedom of contract. Funnily enough, it's not written into the Constitution. It just goes to show what was going on behind the scenes in that and those negotiations. But freedom of contract is very much still a common law right. So what we have is, in effect, a law which says that some people have more freedom of contract than others. People who can earn over the threshold posed by labor laws, in other words, over, say, the minimum wage of 3.5, who can command that package of rights of joining trade unions, being entitled to strike, and still be productive. Only those people are entitled to have freedom of contract. They can negotiate for their benefits. People who fall below that threshold, the disadvantaged, have absolutely no freedom of contract. It's an illusion. So what you have is discrimination between the two groups, the advantaged or the privileged grouping, who are the slightly educated, slightly experienced, trade union affiliated, and so on, better able workers. Whereas your real problem area is the poor people. They get absolutely no freedom of contract. If you compare that, that is a discrimination situation because you discriminate against them on the basis of their socio-economic status. And that being the case, I think it can be attacked under Section 9.
But wouldn't the state argue it's fair discrimination?
That's a very good point. I have looked at that, and it appears to me that if you're seeking to justify discrimination on the basis that the privileged get preference over the underprivileged, that is so fundamentally counter to the values of the Constitution that it cannot be justifiable under Section 36. So I don't think it's fair discrimination. It's grossly unfair.
Yeah, it makes
anyway,
sense.
that one needs to be argued. You can imagine that there will be significant opposition, not only from the opposition itself, but also from members of the bench. They will kick and scream.
So in your book, you mentioned that also a very interesting point. You mentioned that localization, or not local, what, like privatization is basically the lowest form of localization, like federal until you get to a private level. It's like a one-on-one contract. And I spoke to Rob Davis, a very interesting interview. He's the former Minister of Trade in South Africa and a member of the Communist Party. Interesting to hear the other side. And I asked him point blank, why do we need all these ministers? Why can't we delegate things to a federal or a local level? And he told me that would throw things into chaos. Things would be prioritized wrongly. What do you say to that? Why is he wrong in that sense?
Well, just to very, very briefly recap on the principle of decentralization, you're quite right to say that that privatization of the market is the most extreme form of decentralization. But apart from that, one has what you can call decentralization of governance, where the smallest possible group on the ground creates the decisions that govern its own affairs. And that has to be a better decision for that grouping, if only for the reason that they have the most knowledge about it, but secondly also for the reason that they have the best incentive to serve their own interests. And if you duplicate that same process all over the country with little groups, you're going to have the best decisions for all the different situations that you find in the decentralized level. And that has to be a better way of governing. See, what Rob Davis doesn't take account of is the the fact that South Africa is, I think, with the exception of one or two, the most diverse country in the world.
Mm,
It is a shocking realization that we went for the most centralized uh, system
mm,
of government that you can almost imagine, where the power sit in Pretoria and they try and govern what happens in a little town out in the Western Cape or in the Northern Cape or in Limpopo. It cannot possibly be sensible where everybody's languages, everybody's interests, everybody's religions, everybody's socio-economic situation, everything like that is different. And yet we think that we can have a one size fits all solution pushed down onto the populace from the top. Education is an excellent example where there's chaos partly because uh, there's the notion, which is really scientifically accepted now, of mother tongue education is impossible in a situation where you have 11 official
mm,
languages and a whole host of other languages,
mm,
and you push down a system from the top, which is all English and all standardized. And I mean, the United States have shown us what a terrible mishmash that causes if
mm.
you try and force people from a central basis to abide by the same principles. So I have to say I strongly disagree. It's a terribly sad story that we started off with this federal notion. We were almost going in the right direction, but that has gone horribly wrong.
Are you
Um,
talking about the negotiations?
yes, I'm talking about the constitutional negotiations. uh, Paid lip service, I think, in the end to a federal system. But if you look at the real power, where does the money sit? The money sits at the top.
Mm,
Where's the real decision making power? It's at the top, and that it's never going to work. There's not a single example in the world of a diverse country which has managed its economy from the central base, where you have corporatist system. You know, that whole idea of the unions and the government sitting in Pretoria, all coming together around a centralized table. There's not a single example. Those examples that are thrown against our heads are all homogenous societies.
mm.
Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, they all work because everybody's on the same page, everybody comes from the same background, everybody speaks the same language, literally
Mm.
and figuratively.
Yeah,
So we're just on the wrong track.
what's interesting
Sorry,
to me
no, that
What's interesting to me is that when I tell people, okay, we should send things to a federal or a local level, a lot of people say, but that's going to throw things into chaos. They don't know how to manage things at a local level. But then I tell them they already don't know that, right? I mean, it's not like the situation can get worse. And if you send it to a local level, at least there's competition. So now you have Cape Town or Western Cape competing with Limpopo. And if things go badly in Limpopo, people come here. Things
yes,
go badly here, people go to Limpopo.
yes,
At least you're creating competition.
that's right. And you're going to have people literally voting with their feet.
Mm,
And it's already happening to some extent, incidentally, to the very limited extent that the Western Cape is allowed by statute to decide its own fate. It's doing so successfully to
mm,
a great extent, and the I've just looked at the recent reports from the Auditor General on clean audits, and it's actually shocking to see how different it is according to party lines. And that's only one example. There are many others. So I believe that that principle will be tenfold more effective if we could have true decentralization, and you will see examples of success and examples of failure, and people will start moving to the societies. They might not even know. Very often people don't even decide, oh, I want to go to the so and so governed system. They just know there are job opportunities. I want to go and work there.
Mm.
So in that way, success will emerge.
The one last question that I want to touch on is welfare reform. So, what is your opinion, like the best way to tackle this massive welfare grants bureaucracy? For example, is it like a well, obviously we have to find some sort of compromise. You can't just get him all off grants
Cut,
tomorrow.
cut it all off. Yeah,
So,
I would think.
yeah,
Sorry. Um, to me, you have to create incentives for people to do something better. So it seems to me to have an alternative. The moment there's an alternative which is preferable, people will start moving off. You wean people off welfare. So one way of doing it is to say that you simply create these pockets of employment, for example, where welfare is not an option, because you're better off, and you don't want welfare in any event. You just move from one system to the other, but you have one way traffic. You don't want to move back. So once you off it, you then an employed person. And of course, if you lose your job again, then you're part of that market. You have to have a way. Somewhere along the line, there will be a measure of pain, but I think everybody accepts that if you were to cut off 18 million welfare checks tomorrow,
yeah,
there will be another revolution.
yeah. But I mean, for example, like, would you be in favor of a universal basic income? Like, get rid of the entire welfare state, just give someone a blank check every month, and for example, perhaps limit it to like 5 years. You can only claim it for 5 years if you're unemployed.
It goes against the grain of the principle that there should not be something for nothing. I don't believe you ever stop that. I know you say 5 years, but politically,
They will extend it.
after 5 years, there's a demand for an extension. I think a far better way is to almost have uh, an attrition. It sort of just gets watered down over time, as alternatives become more prevalent. But I think the emphasis is wrong. There's always this notion of what can government do for us. I don't think government should do anything for us. I think there should be better alternatives provided by the private sector, and that will create its own uh, dynamo. People will start being attracted to that kind of living. Uh, it has a momentum.
Mm,
The moment people start getting benefits, I mean, you can look at the Eastern Bloc countries. People moved; they were attracted to those opportunities as soon as they could possibly grab them, uh, and they started working and making a living. And nobody is suggesting it will be free of pain. There is no change that is free of pain, but that's a far preferable situation than the one where as I say, we essentially have induced this massive passivity. Where, and can you imagine what that does to your dignity and to your personal pride as a human being?
mm,
To sit at home, you almost pay people not to work,
mm.
because it's almost as if you get the grant because you're unemployed. You get the grant because you are not productive. What sort of a nation do you build that way?
And
It's,
that
it's,
sort of ties back to our first questions, is that probably incites people to go towards the EFF because they now want an excuse. They want to say, I'm feeling terrible at myself. Someone else must be to blame, right? This welfare has produced such a terrible feeling in me. Who is to blame for this? I don't want to blame myself.
no, I agree. I think people tend to have people tend to want someone to blame, and if they can blame government That's a relatively easy target, but it's not simple as we've seen in this country. The same people who blame government and protest will still vote for them.
Mm,
It's this almost a Stockholm syndrome where you are held captive by drip fed handouts,
mm,
and you are it's a bit like an addict.
mm.
You're a drug addict.
Yeah.
You can't escape. It's a cycle that you can't escape. And the only way to escape it, I think, is to provide a better alternative.
Mm. I love your idea about in welfare like having attrition or like diminishing effects. But yeah, I see we're running out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation, Frans. Thank you so much for your time. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Well, I really enjoyed talking. It's never ever possible to finish this conversation. I think if I can conclude, is to say let's continue by looking at what ways there are, and as I say, continue is on a future occasion, what ways there are for ordinary people to make a difference, because I think that's where the future lies, not asking government for benefits.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Frans. If you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. My name is Donald. This has been WorldView.